I had always enjoyed night drives. The quiet roads, the rhythmic hum of the tires, and the cool air through the cracked window. It was my favorite way to unwind. But one night in late November, that peaceful solitude turned into a memory I'll never forget. I was heading back to my hometown after visiting a friend in the city. The drive was supposed to take 2 hours, mostly through rural backroads. I had done this drive dozens of times, and I knew the route like the back of my hand. That night, though, the road seemed different, as if the darkness had swallowed up familiar landmarks. The night was unusually quiet, and my car's headlights barely seemed to cut through the dense fog that clung to the road. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to fatigue, and turned the radio on for some company. About 45 minutes into the drive, I saw something on the side of the road. A man standing under a flickering streetlight. He was dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. I slowed the car slightly, unsure if he needed help, but as I got closer, he stepped back into the darkness, disappearing entirely. Probably just a hitchhiker, I muttered to myself, though the sight of him left an uneasy feeling in my chest. I picked up speed, eager to put distance between me and whatever that had been. About 20 minutes later, my heart nearly stopped when I spotted him again. The same man, now standing by an old mile marker, his silhouette unmistakable. This time, I didn't slow down. I sped past him, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. My brain scrambled to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe he had a bike or a car and had somehow gotten ahead of me. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. The road grew narrower as I drove, the dense trees on either side forming a tunnel of shadows. I turned the radio off, the silence now feeling heavier than the static. The only sounds were the faint hum of the engine and my own breathing. That's when I saw him again. He was standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in the path of my car. My heart leaped into my throat as I slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched, the car skidding to a halt just feet away from him. For a moment, we stared at each other. Or at least I thought we did. His face was still hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze boring into me. I rolled down the window slightly, my voice shaky. "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the passenger side of the car. Panic surged through me, but I was frozen, unable to react as he opened the door and climbed inside. "Drive," he said, his voice low and calm. I don't know why I obeyed him, but I did. My hands trembled as I put the car in gear and started driving. The man didn't say anything else at first, just stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. Where do you need to go?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just keep driving," he said. The tension in the car was suffocating. I could feel him watching me out of the corner of his eye, though I didn't dare look at him directly. The road seemed endless, the fog thickening until it felt like we were driving through a void. "Why were you out there?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Without a word, he handed it to me. I glanced at it briefly, my stomach turning. It was an old newspaper clipping, the edges yellowed and torn. The headline read, "Local man found dead after mysterious disappearance." The photo beneath the headline showed the man sitting next to me. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "That's you," I stammered. He didn't respond, his expression unreadable. Panic took over, and I pressed harder on the gas, desperate to reach the next town, or anywhere with people. But the road stretched endlessly, the trees and fog closing in tighter with every mile. "Where are we?" I asked, my voice cracking. He finally turned to look at me, and I wished he hadn't. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and empty, like those of a corpse. "We're almost there," he said. "Almost where?" The question screamed in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to ask it out loud. Suddenly, the car began to sputter. The engine coughed and died, and we rolled to a stop on the side of the road. "No," I whispered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. Come on. "It's time," he said, his voice eerily calm. He opened the door and stepped out of the car, disappearing into the fog. I sat there, frozen, my hands still gripping the wheel. Then, faintly, I heard it, a low, rhythmic tapping coming from the back of the car. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Through the fogged-up rear window, I saw movement. Something, or someone, was inside the trunk. I stumbled out of the car, my knees weak, and ran to the back. With trembling hands, I unlocked the trunk and lifted it open. It was empty. I stood there, my breath visible in the cold air, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I heard the voice, low and guttural, whispering from somewhere in the trees. "Keep driving." I didn't wait to be told twice. I jumped back into the car, turned the key, and miraculously, the engine roared to life. I drove faster than I ever had, the fog finally starting to thin as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. When I finally reached the safety of a diner at the edge of town, I parked the car and sat in silence, trying to process what had happened. As I stepped out, I glanced at the passenger seat. There, resting on the cracked vinyl, was the newspaper clipping. I still don't know who, or what, got into my car that night, but I'll never forget his final words, "Keep driving." It was late October when my best friend, Olivia, and I decided to take a road trip through the desert. The plan was to explore a few ghost towns, snap some Instagram-worthy photos, and enjoy the eerie stillness of the open road. The trip was going well until we decided to drive late into the night to make up for lost time. The desert was beautiful at dusk, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the landscape transformed into a cold, empty void. The only light came from the full moon and the faint glow of our car's headlights as they sliced through the darkness. The road stretched endlessly ahead of us, flanked by barren land and the occasional cluster of scrubby plants. We hadn't seen another car for hours, and the isolation was beginning to feel oppressive. To distract ourselves, we cranked up the music and played a game of Would You Rather, laughing at each other's ridiculous answers. Everything was fine until Olivia spotted something in the distance. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing ahead. I squinted at the road. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as we got closer, I saw what she meant, a faint light flickering on the horizon. "It's probably a gas station or something," I said, trying to reassure her. "We could use a break anyway." But as we got closer, the light didn't look like it belonged to a building. It hovered just above the ground, shifting and pulsing like a firefly caught in the wind. It didn't make sense, but I was too intrigued to stop. "Let's check it out," Olivia said, leaning forward in her seat. "I don't think that's a good idea," I replied, unease creeping into my voice. "It doesn't look natural." Despite my hesitation, we continued toward the light. The closer we got, the stranger it became. It seemed to move away from us, staying just out of reach. The light flickered like a beacon, leading us deeper into the desert. After what felt like miles, we came to a fork in the road. The light hovered over the right path, pulsing more brightly now, as if urging us to follow. "Don't," I said firmly, my grip tightening on the wheel. "Come on," Olivia said. "It's probably nothing. We'll just take a quick look and turn around." Against my better judgment, I turned onto the right path. The road was rougher here, with cracks in the asphalt and patches of sand encroaching on the pavement. The light continued to lead us, but now it seemed to flicker more erratically, almost like it was alive. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. "What the hell?" Olivia said, sitting back in her seat. I slowed the car, scanning the area for any sign of it, but the desert was pitch black. The silence was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the faint rustle of wind. "We should go back," I said, my voice shaky. As I turned the car around, the headlights illuminated something in the distance, a figure standing on the side of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, with his head tilted at an unnatural angle. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, staring at us. "Did you see that?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I see it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I pressed the gas pedal, speeding past the figure, but as we passed, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw that he was gone. The tension in the car was palpable as we drove back toward the main road. But after a few minutes, the headlights caught something else, more figures. They lined the road on either side, spaced out like sentinels. Each one was motionless, their faces obscured by shadows. "Go faster," Olivia said, her voice trembling. "I'm trying," I replied, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The figures didn't move, didn't react, but their presence was suffocating. It felt like they were watching us, judging us. We finally reached the main road, and the figures disappeared as abruptly as they'd appeared. I exhaled a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But the relief was short-lived. As we continued driving, the light reappeared, this time directly in front of us. It was brighter now, almost blinding, and it seemed to grow larger with every second. "What is that?" Olivia cried, shielding her eyes. "I don't know," I shouted, swerving to avoid it. The car skidded to a stop, and the light engulfed us, filling the car with a searing brightness. I felt an overwhelming pressure, like something was pushing down on me, suffocating me. Olivia screamed, and then everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, we were back on the main road, the car idling in the middle of the lane. Olivia was slumped in her seat, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. What just happened?" I stammered. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know." We didn't speak for the rest of the drive, and we never told anyone about what happened. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I see a faint light flickering on the horizon, and I know better than to follow it. It was supposed to be an ordinary late-night drive. I had been visiting my parents in the small rural town where I grew up, and after a long day, I decided to head back to the city where I lived. The road between the two places was familiar to me, about a 3-hour stretch of highways and back roads cutting through farmland and patches of dense forest. I left just after 9 p.m., the moon high in the clear sky. The first hour was uneventful, with only the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. My car's radio was tuned to a classic rock station, the familiar songs helping me stay alert as the road stretched endlessly ahead. But as I transitioned from the main highway onto the smaller back roads, the music cut out, replaced by a sharp burst of static. I fiddled with the dial, trying to find a signal, but every station was the same, just static. Annoyed, I turned the radio off and focused on the road. The forest on either side seemed darker than usual, the trees crowding closer as if trying to swallow the light from my headlights. After about 30 minutes of silence, the radio turned itself back on. At first, I thought I'd bumped the dial, but the volume was much louder than before, and the static was interspersed with faint, distorted voices. I turned it off again, my hand lingering on the knob. My heart was racing, but I told myself it was just a glitch. The road grew narrower as I drove, the trees forming a tunnel of shadows overhead. Then, out of nowhere, the static returned, louder and more insistent, as if someone was trying to tune into my frequency. This time, I heard something that made my skin crawl, faint whispers beneath the noise. "Help me." The voice was weak, distorted, but unmistakable. I slammed on the brakes, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but it was empty. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm my racing heart. "It's just my imagination," I muttered. "Just a weird signal." But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I put the car in gear and started driving again, faster this time. The static continued, the whispers growing louder, more frantic. "Help, trapped, can't get out?" The voice was that of a young woman, her words broken by bursts of static. I reached for the radio, ready to turn it off again, but before I could, the voice changed. "Turn around." The words were sharp and clear, cutting through the noise like a knife. My stomach churned as I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing but darkness, but then, faintly, I noticed movement, shadows shifting in the distance, too far to make out clearly. I pressed harder on the gas, the car accelerating down the narrow road. The static grew louder, the whispers overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Turn around, turn around, turn around." I felt a chill run down my spine as I rounded a bend in the road and saw something that made my heart stop. A figure was standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. She was barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress, her long hair matted and hanging over her face. Her head was tilted at an unnatural angle, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. I swerved to avoid her, the car skidding onto the shoulder before I regained control. When I looked back, she was gone. The whispers and the static became screams, the sound so loud it felt like it was inside my head. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, the car now hurtling down the road at dangerous speeds. "Stop!" the voice bellowed, and suddenly, the car's engine died. I coasted to a stop, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. Then, everything went dark. I sat in the silence, the only sound my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. That's when I heard it, the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no response, just the sound of the footsteps growing closer. I fumbled with the door lock, my fingers trembling. The footsteps stopped, and I felt a presence just outside the driver's side window. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see the woman from the road. But there was nothing there, just an empty void. I was about to start the car again when a loud bang echoed through the night, followed by the sound of shattering glass. I screamed, instinctively ducking as shards of glass rained down on me. When I looked up, the passenger side window was broken, and a dark, shadowy figure was sitting in the seat beside me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure turned its head slowly, its face obscured by darkness, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice distorted like the whispers in the static. Before I could respond, the figure vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of burnt metal. The car roared to life on its own, the engine growling as the headlights flared back on. The radio crackled, the whispers returning, softer now but still insistent. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the road, my pulse racing. The static faded as I finally reached a familiar intersection, the comforting glow of streetlights in the distance. When I reached home, I parked the car and sat there for a long time, my hands still shaking. The radio was silent now, as if nothing had happened. But when I opened the glove compartment to grab my phone charger, I froze. Sitting there, crumpled and yellowed, was a page torn from an old map. The route it showed didn't exist. To this day, I avoid night drives whenever I can. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone, the radio crackles to life, and I hear faint whispers in the static. And I know the road isn't done with me yet. It was a Thursday night, and I was driving back home after a business trip that had stretched longer than expected. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the dark. My GPS said I had about 3 hours to go before I could collapse into bed, but exhaustion was already clawing at me. To stay awake, I blasted some music and sipped on coffee from a convenience store cup. The caffeine helped, but it wasn't enough to shake the growing heaviness in my limbs. The road was deserted, save for the occasional flicker of headlights from distant cars. About an hour into the drive, I noticed something odd. In the rearview mirror, a faint silhouette seemed to flicker in the back seat. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly glanced over my shoulder, but the back seat was empty. Shaking my head, I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I adjusted the mirror so I wouldn't see the back seat, trying to focus on the road ahead. The highway seemed to stretch on forever, the trees lining it merging into a black wall on either side. That's when I saw it. A man standing on the shoulder, illuminated briefly by my headlights. He wasn't walking, wasn't hitchhiking, just standing there, staring straight ahead. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I passed him, I swore his head turned to follow my car, but I didn't dare look back. A few minutes later, I saw another figure on the side of the road. Another man, standing eerily still. This time, I slowed down slightly, curiosity getting the better of me. He was wearing a suit, his expression blank, almost mannequin-like. I thought about pulling over to ask if he needed help, but something stopped me. My gut screamed that it was a bad idea. As I drove past, I glanced in the mirror, but he was gone. My heart was pounding now, and the air in the car felt heavier. I decided to pull into the next rest stop to collect myself and maybe grab another coffee. The rest stop was dimly lit, with just a few cars parked near the gas station. I parked under a light, hoping the brightness would make me feel safer. Inside the station, I bought a bottle of water and some gum, hoping they'd help me stay alert. As I walked back to the car, I froze. There, under another light post, stood a man in a suit, the same one I'd seen on the highway. He was staring directly at me, his face eerily calm. My pulse quickened as I fumbled for my keys, practically throwing myself into the car. I locked the doors and started the engine, refusing to look back as I sped out of the lot. The highway was darker now, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was all just a coincidence, or maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. About half an hour later, my car started acting up. The engine sputtered, and the lights flickered before the entire car came to a jerking halt on the side of the road. I sat there for a moment, stunned, before grabbing my phone to call roadside assistance. As I waited, I kept glancing at the mirrors, half expecting to see the man in the suit again. The road was empty, but the silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. Then I heard it, a faint tapping on the window. I whipped around, but there was no one there. My breathing quickened as I scanned the area, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. Another tap, this time louder, came from the rear window. I turned slowly, and my blood turned to ice. Sitting in the back seat, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard, was the man in the suit. His expression was the same as before, calm, neutral, and entirely wrong. I screamed and threw open the door, stumbling out of the car and into the darkness. When I turned back, the man was gone. Moments later, a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. A truck pulled up, and the driver, an older man with a kind face, rolled down his window. "You okay, son?" he asked. I nodded shakily, explaining what had happened. He offered to wait with me until roadside assistance arrived, and I gratefully accepted. When the tow truck finally came, I glanced back at my car one last time. In the reflection of the rear window, I thought I saw a shadow move, but when I blinked, it was gone. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me, or maybe it was something else, something I don't want to understand. All I know is that I'll never drive those empty highways at night again. It was supposed to be a straightforward drive home, just 2 hours of highway and back roads to my small apartment in the suburbs. I had spent the weekend visiting my sister in a nearby city, and by the time I hit the road, it was already well past sunset. The cool autumn air rolled in as I drove, the stars barely visible through the faint mist clinging to the ground. The first hour of the drive was uneventful, just the hum of the tires on the road and the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. The isolation didn't bother me. I even enjoyed it. But as the road curved into a thick patch of woods, I noticed the mist growing denser. It wasn't normal mist. This fog seemed alive, rolling in waves that clung to the road, obscuring the treetops and swallowing the moonlight. My visibility shrank with every mile until my headlights barely cut through the swirling gray. About 10 minutes into the fog, I saw a sign, Wilson Bridge, 1 mile. It was old and rusted, barely hanging onto its post. I didn't remember a bridge being on this route, but the detour I'd taken earlier might have rerouted me. Still, something about the sign made me uneasy. The fog thickened as I approached the bridge, the structure looming out of the mist like a ghostly sentinel. Its iron framework was rusted and decayed, and the wooden planks beneath the tires creaked ominously as I crossed. About halfway across, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the middle of the bridge. The person, if it was a person, was barely visible through the haze. They stood motionless, their face obscured by shadows, their clothes hanging loosely on their frame. I slowed the car, unsure whether to stop or turn around. "Hey!" I called out, rolling down the window slightly. My voice sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I debated what to do. Just as I was about to reverse off the bridge, the figure moved, jerking forward like a puppet on strings. I slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the damp planks. The figure was closer now, and I could see their face, or rather, the absence of it. The features were blurred, as if someone had erased them. The sight was so unnatural, so wrong, that I couldn't process it. Then they started running. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as the figure gave chase. The bridge seemed endless, the fog distorting everything around me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. Just as I thought I'd escaped, the figure appeared in front of me again, this time on the side of the road. They stood perfectly still, their head tilted unnaturally, watching as I sped past. The fog lifted shortly after I left the bridge, and the road returned to normal. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of town. The attendant looked up as I stumbled inside, pale and shaking. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Is there a Wilson Bridge around here?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression darkened. "Not anymore," he said. "That bridge collapsed years ago. Took a couple of cars with it." I didn't ask any more questions. I didn't want to know. To this day, I avoid that route entirely. But sometimes, when I'm driving at night, I think I see someone standing on the side of the road, their face obscured by shadows. And I wonder if they're waiting for another car to cross that bridge. The road trip was supposed to be our last big adventure before life got too serious. My fiancée, Rachel, and I had decided to take one last cross-country drive before settling into the routine of wedding planning, work, and everything that came with adulthood. The plan was simple: drive during the day, camp at night, and make memories we could look back on when life got too busy. By the third night, we'd strayed from the main highways and found ourselves on a desolate stretch of road somewhere in the Midwest. The GPS signal had been unreliable for hours, and the stars above us were the only source of light besides our headlights. "We should stop soon," Rachel said, her voice laced with fatigue. "I don't want to fall asleep in the middle of nowhere." "I know," I replied, scanning the road ahead. "There's got to be something coming up." As if on cue, a flickering sign appeared in the distance. It was an old gas station, the kind that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1950s. A faded sign above the pumps read, "Hollow Pines Gas and Service," and a single bulb illuminated the front of the building. "This is creepy," Rachel muttered, "but I guess it'll have to do." I pulled up to the pump, the gravel crunching under the tires. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made you second-guess your decision to stop. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. "Stay in the car," I told Rachel. "I'll see if they're open." The gas station door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of dust and oil. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sickly glow over the shelves of outdated snacks and dusty cans of motor oil. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. There was no response, but I spotted a bell on the counter and rang it. The sound was sharp, cutting through the silence. A moment later, a man appeared from the back room. He was tall and gaunt, with sunken eyes and a thin mustache. His uniform was faded, the name Earl embroidered on the chest. "Evening," he said, his voice gravelly. "Need some gas?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "And maybe some directions." Earl nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on me a little too long. "You're a ways off from anything around here. Fill up, and I'll grab you a map." I returned to the car, uneasy but trying not to show it. Rachel had locked the doors and was scrolling through her phone, though the lack of signal meant she wasn't getting much out of it. "Something feels off," she said as I started pumping the gas. "This place gives me the creeps." "I know," I admitted. "Let's just fill up and get out of here." As the tank filled, I glanced toward the woods that bordered the gas station. The trees were tall and shadowy, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers against the night sky. Something about them felt wrong, like they were watching us. Once the car was fueled, I went back inside to pay. Earl was standing behind the counter, a map spread out in front of him. "Here," he said, pointing to a spot on the map. "You'll want to head back the way you came. Take the first right and follow that road. It'll get you back to the main highway." "Thanks," I said, though his directions didn't match what the GPS had shown earlier. But I didn't want to argue. I just wanted to leave. As I handed him the cash, he leaned in slightly. "Be careful out there," he said. "Things get strange on these roads at night." I nodded and hurried back to the car. Rachel looked at me expectantly. "What did he say?" "He gave me directions," I replied, unfolding the map. "But I don't know if I trust him." We decided to follow his advice, figuring it couldn't hurt to try. The road he mentioned was narrow and winding, the kind that felt more like a path through the woods than a proper road. The headlights barely illuminated the way, and the trees seemed to press closer with every mile. After about 20 minutes, the road opened up into a clearing, and to our shock, we found ourselves back at the gas station. This isn't possible," Rachel stammered. "We didn't turn around." My heart was pounding as I parked the car and got out. The station looked exactly the same, down to the flickering sign and the light bulb over the door. But something felt different, darker, more sinister. "Stay here," I told Rachel, though I could see the fear in her eyes. As I approached the station, the door creaked open before I touched it. Inside, the shelves were empty, the lights dimmer than before. Earl was nowhere to be seen, but his map was still spread out on the counter. I turned to leave, but the sound of footsteps stopped me. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the back room. My heart raced as I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. "Leaving so soon?" Earl's voice rasped from the shadows. I froze, the hairs on my neck standing on end. What's going on here?" He stepped into the light, his expression eerily calm. "You shouldn't have come back," he said. "They don't like it when people find their way out." "Who's they?" I demanded, but he didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head toward the window. I turned to look and felt my blood run cold. Figures stood at the edge of the clearing, their silhouettes barely visible in the moonlight. They were tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. "You need to leave," Earl said. "Now." I didn't wait for an explanation. I ran back to the car, my breath coming in gasps. "We have to go," I told Rachel, starting the engine. "What's happening?" she asked, panic in her voice. "Just hold on," I said, flooring the gas pedal. The figures didn't move as we sped past, but I could feel their eyes on us. The road seemed longer this time, stretching endlessly as if it didn't want us to leave. But eventually, the trees thinned, and we found ourselves back on the main highway. We drove in silence for hours, too afraid to stop. When we finally reached a motel, we collapsed into bed, exhausted and shaken. The next morning, I unfolded the map Earl had given me, hoping to make sense of what had happened. The map was blank. To this day, I don't know what we encountered at that gas station. But every time I drive through the countryside, I feel a chill when I see a flickering sign. And I wonder if Hollow Pines is still out there, waiting for someone else to stop. It was the middle of summer, and I was driving back to my hometown after spending a few days visiting friends in the city. The trip was supposed to take about 4 hours, mostly along quiet highways and winding back roads. I'd driven the route dozens of times before, but something about that night felt different, off, somehow. The first couple of hours passed without incident. The sun had set about an hour into the drive, and the dense trees lining the highway seemed to press closer as the darkness deepened. I had the radio on low, a mix of static and fading music keeping me company as I sipped a lukewarm coffee from a gas station stop earlier in the day. Around 10 p.m., I noticed something strange. The road ahead seemed to stretch longer than I remembered. It wasn't just my imagination. The landmarks I usually passed at this point were nowhere to be seen. I glanced at the GPS on my phone, but the signal had dropped completely. The blue dot floated aimlessly in the middle of a blank map. Frustration began to creep in as I scanned the road for any signs of life, but the highway was completely deserted. The isolation didn't bother me at first. It was late, after all, and I wasn't expecting much traffic. But as the minutes turned into hours, The silence in the car became deafening. The trees seemed taller, their branches forming an archway over the road, and the air felt heavier, almost suffocating. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I'd simply taken a wrong turn. I kept an eye out for a rest stop or a gas station where I could get directions, but the highway remained eerily empty. Then, just as I was starting to consider pulling over, I spotted a road sign ahead. It was old and rusted, the paint chipped and peeling, but I could just make out the words, Route 13 to 10 miles. The name didn't sound familiar, but it was better than nothing. I turned onto the road, the tires crunching over the gravel before settling onto cracked asphalt. The new route was narrower, flanked by dense woods on both sides. The headlights barely cut through the growing fog, which seemed to cling to the car like a living thing. I drove for what felt like an eternity, but the road just kept going, winding deeper into the forest. The further I went, the stranger things became. At first, it was subtle, a shadow darting across the road, the flicker of movement in the trees. Then I started noticing more unsettling details. The trees looked wrong, their trunks gnarled and twisted, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like blood. The real terror set in when I realized the road wasn't just winding. It was looping. I passed the same rusted mile marker 3 times, each time more rusted and deteriorated than before. Panic began to set in as I gripped the wheel tighter, my heart pounding. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, but the display was frozen, 2:17 a.m., though I was certain hours had passed since I'd last checked. The fog grew thicker, and I was forced to slow down to a crawl. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A faint light glowing in the distance. It was a gas station, the first sign of life I'd seen in hours. Relief flooded through me as I pulled into the lot, my tires skidding slightly on the damp pavement. The station looked old and worn, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the mist. I parked near the pumps and stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. The station was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint buzz of the overhead lights. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. A man appeared from around the corner, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. He was older, with a scruffy beard and a vacant expression. "Lost?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "I've been driving for hours, and I think I took a wrong turn. Can you tell me where this road leads?" The man's expression darkened. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "This road doesn't go anywhere." "What do you mean?" I asked, my unease growing. He didn't answer. Instead, he handed me a map, the edges yellowed and torn. "Follow this," he said, "and don't stop for anything." Before I could ask more questions, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I climbed back into the car, my hands shaking as I unfolded the map. It didn't make sense. There were no labels, just a single line drawn through a maze of trees. But I had no other options. I started driving again, following the map as best I could. The road grew narrower and rougher, the fog closing in until I could barely see a few feet ahead. Then I saw them, figures standing on the side of the road, barely visible through the mist. They didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, watching as I passed. My stomach churned as I realized there were more of them ahead, lining the road like sentinels. Their faces were obscured by the fog, but I could feel their eyes on me. The car's engine sputtered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to stall. But it roared back to life just as one of the figures stepped into the road. I swerved to avoid them, my heart pounding as the car skidded onto the shoulder. When I looked back, the figure was gone, but the others had moved closer. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same twisted trees and rusted mile markers repeating like a nightmare loop. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the fog began to thin, and the trees gave way to open fields. A faint light appeared on the horizon, and I realized it was the highway. I pulled onto the main road, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The clock on the dashboard flickered back to life. 4:15 a.m. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. At a diner, I tried to tell the waitress what had happened, but she just shook her head. "Route 13, she said. "That road's been closed for years. Nothing out there but trees and old ghost stories." I didn't argue. I didn't even finish my coffee. I just got back in the car and kept driving, determined to put as much distance between myself and that cursed road as possible. Even now, I avoid back roads at night, but sometimes, when I'm driving alone, I see figures standing in the fog, their eyes watching me from the shadows. And I wonder if I'll ever truly escape Route 13.